Aloha, you're listening to Chad Ford's NBA Big Board on the Locked On Podcast Network, our first week of streaming live on YouTube. I'm with my longtime guest, John Hollinger from The Athletic. John, great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's really cool to be doing this now in video, as well as, wherever you're listening to a podcast right now. Before we kick off the show, I want to remind you that this week is the week of the NBA draft. And that means that if you want to follow me, along with Rafael Barlow, along with Locked On NBA host John Corrales live during the draft, we're going to be streaming through YouTube. It's Locked On NBA Draft 2021, brought to you by Built Bar. Get local expert analysis on each pick, followed by Locked On NBA YouTube today for our live coverage starting July 29th at 7 p.m. That's going to be a lot of fun, a lot of draft takes, going to bring in all of our local hosts and experts to get their reactions as well. I think it's going to be a really, really cool show. If you want some alternative to the other live draft stuff that's out there. John, we've been talking about this draft all year.
Yeah.
And now it's crunch time. Right. This is the week of the draft. And maybe just take us through. You've been working in front offices for a long time. I think there's this sort of expectation maybe among fans that this is all said and done for NBA teams. Right. By now, they know exactly who they're going to take. Their draft board is all finalized, and it's sort of just sit back and maybe explore trades and what have you. What does it look like the week of the draft for most of these NBA teams?
Yeah, so by this point, the draft board is usually done. A lot of teams probably had a big old meeting this week where they finalized their draft board. The thing is, though, that there's always last minute information comes up that modifies things. Players are still working out for teams, for one. Then you have situations where you're still getting information maybe on the physical end for some of these guys. And so that can change things. So really right up until draft day, that board still is seeing motion. And it may not be a lot of motion, but it's still definitely happening.
And what's happening on a trade front right now? There's trades every year, and we always sort of joke, oh, these trade rumors, they're all junk. There's just smoke. There's no fire. But then every draft, there's typically quite a bit of fire that actually happens in the draft. What does that sort of look like right now? Is the trade talks? Is this like starting Monday? Is this when teams start to get really serious about those talks?
The serious calls probably start on Monday, and really, though, so many teams don't want to make a move until they're on the clock that really Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of draft week is usually mostly information collection. Not always. I mean, we do see some trades happen ahead of time, and you'll typically get one or two kind of interesting proposals in that time from teams that are okay just making a move ahead of time or doing something maybe tangential to the draft. Like, I want this player, I'll give you a second round pick, that kind of thing. So that kind of thing does happen, but it's really draft night when most of the trades go down. Cause a lot of teams, you'll talk to a team theoretically about maybe, hey, I'll trade you 20 and 14 for 9, hypothetically. But until they know who they can get by moving up, they're not going to act on it. So you have a lot of trade proposals that are out there and that you're going to circle back to during the course of the draft, but you can't really act on them yet.
Every year the draft is different in that the quality of the draft, both at the top, in the middle, towards the back end of the draft, are different, which means there's different sorts of values and different sorts of incentives to trade up, to trade down, what have you. And I know one of the things that you do every year is, part of it is an analytic formula about sort of ranking players. And then based off that formula, you can sort of tell how players might rank based off of past years. And I'm really curious because people have been really excited about this draft. There's so much talk about how strong the draft is, especially at the top of the draft. Let's start there. Historically, since you've been sort of looking at drafts and rating drafts, how does the top of this draft compare to a typical draft?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's super strong at number one in particular. Like, I don't know if Cade Cunningham, like, he's a good number one prospect, but he's not like, this isn't a LeBron James AD type of draft, right?
Right.
Spots 2 through say 6, I do think it's a strong draft. I think that's probably the best part of this draft, that you have a lot of players with all-star talent who are going to be available in the top 5, and probably more. I mean, certainly than compared to last year, for instance, where there were basically, I thought, 2 players who were cut above at the top of the draft last year. This year, you really have probably a 5-player group at the top, and so that's a difference. But then, it's weird because I think it's a good draft there. I think it's a good draft in the 20s and 30s. I don't know if it's a great draft in the teens. I do think it kind of craters after about 8 or 9, and you get into a much lesser area of talent.
It's interesting, as well. We talked about that top 5, though. Interestingly, I think your top 5 is a little different than what we sort of see as the more consensus top 5 coming out, because you have Alperen Sengun
Yes.
in your top 5, if I remember right. You have Scotty Barnes
Yes.
in your top 5. And while I think Barnes definitely is in the top 5 of a lot of NBA teams, he's not in everyone. Kuminga is not in your top 5.
No.
And Jalen Green barely makes your top 5.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's great. I think I had him 5th, right? Yeah. So to make room for Barnes and Sengun, I ended up with Green 5 and Jalen Suggs 6.
Wow. Yeah. So Jalen Suggs is the guy that falls a little bit.
Yeah. I think those 6 players are kind of the key 6 guys in this draft. And then you start stepping down at 7, 8, 9 when you get into, for me at least, like Kuminga and Franz Wagner and guys like that. And then there's kind of another step down right around 10. Jalen Johnson, I think, is viewed as more of a dice roll. Josh Giddey, I think, is a little more of an unknown. And then after Giddey, I think you get into some guys who maybe wouldn't go in the 11 to 15 range in a normal draft, but probably will in this one.
One of the things that you've consistently talked about and written is that there's essentially 20 players in every draft, right? That if you sort of look historically, there's 20 guys, and there's always so much interest from fans that are drafting. Their teams are drafting in the late 20s, early 30s. Are we going to get a guy here? And I think historically the answer is probably not.
Right.
Right. But you mentioned that the draft is strong in the 20s and 30s. Does that mean you're a little bit more bullish in this draft, that this draft may go deeper than the typical 20 that you tend to get in a draft?
I'm not sure if the hit rate in the 20s and 30s is going to be higher than usual. I just think the quality of the hits might be. In other words, that a couple of these guys who end up going in the 20s and are kind of speculative picks, like these kind of Ziaire Williams, Josh Primo types, 7 or 8 and 10 will probably bomb, but the ones that'll hit can hit at a pretty high level. And so there's a lot of risk reward at that point in the draft, just because there's an unusual number, I think, of one and dones who are kind of visibly toolsy, but really had poor college track records. And so there's just a wide variance outcomes with these guys.
That was one of the things that as I was, putting together what's running on Friday, which is my personal mock draft, what I would do if I was the GM for all 30 of these picks. I started to find that dilemma as we got into the teens and 20s. Do you take maybe a more established senior or, junior, or do you take one of these freshmen that at the start of the season were sitting at, lottery picks on my board and say, I'm going to disregard some of what happened in college this freshman year and instead focus on what we saw in high school, in part because this was a very unique freshman year. For most of these prospects, because of what happened with COVID, what happened the summer before, their freshman year, practice time and just the ability to be on the court with other players was diminished quite a bit. Some people like Ziaire Williams didn't play a home game all year and was living out of a hotel room all year.
Yeah.
You had deaths in the families of some of these players. You had mental health issues and isolation that was facing a lot of these prospects. And so maybe one of the things that I think is so hard, especially with the freshman class this year, is to what extent did COVID affect everything from their conditioning to their ability to integrate to their teams, to their mental health, and may have affected ultimately what we saw on the court. And I know that that's a question a lot of NBA teams are asking. Teams have team psychologists often that can sort of chime in on these things. But do you see that as a real factor this year?
It's a factor, and it's hard because you don't know how much to weigh this factor. And it's because it's a unique circumstance, right? And I think it's unique with each individual player and program too. Like, the example you used, I think what Stanford faced with Ziaire Williams was different than maybe even what some other college teams faced, just because they were kicked out of their home gym for a month or whatever it was. So I think that's another confounding variable that makes the job more difficult for teams, especially as you get into these more speculative prospects where it's maybe not a one-to-one translation from what they did in college, and they have to get better at some things or do some things differently as pros. And I think that just makes the eval really hard.
Yeah. And we've talked. I've talked to some trainers. I've talked to some agents. I've talked to some NBA teams that say, look, it also affected conditioning. That was out there for some guys. It's just different what you could do to prepare, and maybe why you're starting to see in some workouts. Like we hear every year, oh, the guy gained 20 pounds of muscle or he lost 20 pounds of fat.
Yeah.
He learned to shoot since the college basketball season was over. And, you take all of that with a grain of salt. You're literally going to hear that constantly. But in this particular case, I actually think that it is more likely that you did see some of those outcomes from some of these prospects, just because their ability to do some of that stuff was so severely restricted through much of the college basketball season, but then was opened wide up after the season was over. It's going to be really, really one of the difficult things of wrestling here. I do a tiers column, and the tiers, based off of, potential superstars, potential all-stars, potential high-level starter, tier 3, potential starter / rotation player, tier 4, deep rotations, tier 5. Who do you have as a tier 1 this year? Like you're rating them as they could be, their ceiling is a potential superstar right now. I'm assuming Cade Cunningham is one of those guys. Or is he not even a tier 1 guy for you?
Yeah, I don't know. I usually am very conservative with tier 1. When we did our draft boards in Memphis, I don't know. We saved tier 1 for maybe every couple of years, and so
I didn't have a tier 1 last year.
Yeah.
And probably fair, though LaMelo's playing like a tier 1 prospect now. You don't even have Cade in tier 1 this year.
No, I don't. Wow. It's funny though, when you said tiers for this draft, I thought you were talking about you crying because there's no Kansas players.
Well, Quentin Grimes, we'll sort of adopt him in this year as maybe our Kansas player that gets drafted. Okay, so no tier 1. Then I'm assuming Cade is a tier 2 for you.
I think kind of the next 6 guys are all tier 2 for me. I think it's closer.
You got a big tier 2.
Yeah. I think it's closer at the top than people think. So I would go from probably Cade down to Suggs, who's number 6 on my board as a tier 2. So I would include Evan Mobley, Alperen Şengün, Jalen Green, and Scotty Barnes in that as well.
Okay, so that's your tier 2. Then you talked about there's the draft drops off a cliff.
Yeah.
Are there any tier 3 guys then for you? Is like a Kuminga a tier 3 guy for you?
Yeah, I would say Kuminga, Franz Wagner. Jalen Johnson is probably like borderline tier 3 for me. And then I'm trying to pull up my draft board here because I feel like there's somebody I'm forgetting.
Josh Giddey's, I think, the next guy on your board after that.
Yeah, I would say, Giddey's probably like a tier 3.5 for me. Okay. and then we're pretty clearly into tier 4.
Yeah, tier 4. And so now you're talking about guys that might be able to start in the NBA, but probably aren't high level starters, kind of 6th, 7th men on teams. And so there you go. That's where John's sort of talking about the draft starting to crater, that maybe you want a few more tier 3 guys in the back half of the lottery than maybe you're getting here. John's starting at about 10 to say we're already into tier 4. But then maybe quite a few tier 5 guys is what you're saying in the 20s and 30s. Guys that can be rotation players.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's it.
And some of them are kind of high risk, high reward guys, so that you're putting them in tier 5 now, but they could end up being starters. Just the chance that they completely bomb is also pretty high.
Yeah,
when you get into like these JT Thor types, where it's just completely speculative.
Yeah, or Kai Jones, frankly, for that matter, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Kai Jones is one of those guys that you could see potentially having a tier 1 career and potentially falling out of the league in 2 years.
Yeah, totally.
Career as well. And one of the things that I just actually had a reader suggest is that we do that sort of tier range for every prospect. It's not enough just to place them in the tier, but what are the likelihood of outcomes for players? And I think one of the things that makes Cade Cunningham so attractive is it's hard to see him falling into like tier 4 or tier 5 category as a prospect. His floor is just higher than that, where some players it's just wild. And then there's a few players maybe like, Jared Butler, who, maybe his ceiling is tier 3 and maybe his floor, if he stays healthy, is tier 3, right? Like it's just sort of where, he is, and there isn't a lot of range.
Yeah, definitely. Corey Kispert would be another one. Yeah. So some of these upperclassmen, you're dealing with much probably narrower bands of outcomes than a lot of these one and dones. But so it's sort of the Dirty Harry question: do you feel lucky, right?
All right. Yeah, that's exactly. And I think that's where we're going to get to next. Is sort of talk about some of these late risers, many of them freshmen that seem to be moving up draft boards that didn't make your initial top 20. But before we do that, let's talk about rockauto.com. With the ever increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questions and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts or their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. Save time and money when using Rock Auto. Why choose to spend 30, 50, or even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership? They have anything and everything from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, and even new carpet. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, locked on in their How Did You Hear About Us box, so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. And I'm back with John Hollinger of The Athletic. We've been talking 2021 NBA draft all year. It is crunch time. It is the week of the draft. And every year we have these guys that start to rise late in the draft based off of essentially workouts. Right at this time, this guy is working out better. This guy's moving up draft boards. Fran Fischel always says, "No, your draft board was just wrong the whole time." That's just what was going on. These guys were always high, and you're just trying to make yourself look good that your draft board was wrong. And maybe there's some truth to that. But it is really interesting in that I talked to a lot of folks around the league that some of the names that I'm hearing surprised me a little bit just based off of sort of where I've heard their range going all year. And so I'm going to throw some of these out to you, John. These were all guys that didn't make your top 20.
Okay.
and just want to sort of get your reaction because a couple of these that I'm going to talk about at first are getting looks as even potential late lottery picks.
Okay.
And so they did make your top 20. Let's start with Cam Thomas. He gets an invite to the green room,
Mm-hmm.
which I think, surprises, surprised me, surprised a lot of people. Amazing score.
Yeah.
Almost nothing else that you can
Yeah.
point to on the stat sheet right now. Undersized for his position, not an elite athlete, but can really score the basketball. How comfortable are you hearing Cam Thomas's name in late lottery, mid first round?
Yeah, I kind of don't get that one. I mean, I could see more him as a dice roll in the 20s, maybe. Can he have like a Jordan Clarkson type of career, maybe? Although he's a little smaller even than Clarkson. He's a bucket getter, really limited in other phases of the game, not that interested in passing. Which sort of limits some of the value of the shot creation. Didn't shoot that well from three, but he's a really good foul shooter. So you hope that'll come around. Just a bad defensive player. Definitely needs to get better on that end. And I don't know. I think for me, he's a guy that I'm much more comfortable with in the 20s and 30s than going in that top 20 group.
One of the things that seems a little bit odd about him too is he's been given the green light his whole life. LSU let him take any shot that he wanted to take. Almost sort of reminds me in a weird way of Jimmer Fredette. That way at BYU. Jimmer Fredette had the ultimate green light. His coach defended his lack of defense by saying, I didn't want him to play defense because I just wanted him to use all of his energy to score and have the rest of the team play that. Jimmer Fredette ends up going in the lottery. Sort of a very similar, like not like a super great athlete, a bit undersized for his position, and just craters out of the league quickly. Now, Jimmer Fredette was quite a bit older. He was 22, I believe, when he was drafted. But, some similarities there. Maybe Buddy Hield, another sort of similarity and a sort of microwave scorer, but, didn't necessarily bring a lot else to the table. Now, Buddy Hield, we found out after the draft, was actually a year older than we thought he was, at 23 years old. So there's a definite difference here with Cameron Thomas being, 19 years old. Any of those comps sort of sound right to you?
It's a little weird because those are much older players. The scoring rate, you compare that with like almost Anthony Edwards a year ago, where he's just getting so many buckets. But again, he's just bringing absolutely nothing else to the table and just doesn't have the same physical gifts that Edwards did.
Let's talk about Ziaire Williams, the other guy that got the invite to the green room, a guy that started the season in my top 10, had just, by I think all accounts, an absolutely disastrous season at Stanford. There's just not a lot that you can really say good about how Ziaire Williams looked, but he was one of the highest rated high school players in the country coming out. If you go and watch that high school film, there's a lot there to like about Ziaire Williams. He seems to, again, have gotten in great shape. He seems to be shooting the ball. He seems to be more aggressive. He's put on some weight. I think 13 pounds is what I heard from, one NBA team, which matters. But you have this 6'10", ball handling, pretty athletic guard that had a really terrible season, had a knee brace on for part of the season. Like we said, was playing out of a hotel room, no home games, had deaths in the family with COVID. When you do the sort of risk reward assessment with Ziaire Williams, I think he ended up at like, 29 or 30, something like that on your board.
Yeah. I had him 30th.
But teams are thinking about him back now in the lottery. I think it starts about Orlando at 8. He's working out for those lottery teams in that sort of range. I know in talking to them that he is in consideration there. I'm not saying he's the favorite or likely to go there, but there's enough intrigue that he's in consideration there. How do you feel about Ziaire Williams as a late lottery pick or mid first round prospect?
Again, probably not great at that level. I mean, there were some things on his tape from Stanford that I think that are maybe a little harder to make excuses for, just in terms of like the inability to get by people and just the fact that you just didn't feel that athleticism at any point during the course of the game, when you watched his games. He can handle the ball a little bit, has some decent footwork getting to step backs, I thought, although not a great shooter overall. But just didn't really make much of an impact, honestly, in the games he played this year. So again, I think he's much more of a speculative pick, and I understand the extenuating circumstances on his season were even more extenuating than on a lot of other players this year. But even giving him the benefit of the doubt on that, I mean, his numbers were worse than anybody's. So, weighing it overall, to me, he's kind of a late first round flyer.
Maybe the only freshman that I could point to that sort of had these numbers and maybe was similar, though they went much, much higher in the draft, was Jaylen Brown out of Cal, who came in highly touted, really struggled as a freshman. I still think he went third in the draft. But analytically, I think everyone was like, how in the world is he a third pick in the draft, and figured it out. But that's sort of the only one that I could point to that looked that bad as a freshman that ended up turning into something. So they're very different players, and so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. I do think 6'10" ball handling guard that probably is going to end up being an okay shooter in the league, and maybe will be more athletic than what we saw in Stanford, where he had that leg brace on, and I think was just frankly, from what I'm hearing, just a little bit worried about re-injuring that and causing problems, which, causes you to be more cautious, whether there's something there. I've actually, to be honest, John, you're going to be very disappointed in me. I'm falling in love with Ziaire Williams when I started watching the high school stuff. And I'm like, we're talking about wings that are intelligent and can be ball handlers and shoot. And he's 6'10", he measured 6'9" and 3/4. I think in shoes at the combine, he intrigues me a little bit. Davion Sharpe. Every team that I've talked to has said two things about Davion Sharpe. One, he looks like he's in the best shape, of his career. He got a little bit heavy again, because of COVID and some things like that, but he's slimmed down. He's moving really well. And that he is shooting the lights out in workouts, which we didn't see at all at North Carolina. He took two threes, I think, the entire season. It was not how Roy Williams was going to play him or use him at North Carolina. You see any justification at all that Davion Sharpe should be getting those sort of looks in the late lottery to mid first round? He is an intriguing passer for a big man.
Yeah, you do like that about him, but I'm not big on drafting fives in general. And then I just don't know what's special about him that you're going to make the exception. You go through his tape, like he didn't do a great job defending on the perimeter last year. He was good in the paint, but I wouldn't say he was dominant. Like, he wasn't a great finisher around the basket. So at the end of the day, what do you get? You're probably getting a backup five, and I just don't know that you need to draft that. It is interesting with him because it seems like nobody can get him in for a workout, and that he might have a promise somewhere, and he might have had a promise from a while ago. So I'm interested to see what happens there.
Really interesting. Again, another young player. We've now talked about, 3 freshmen. Let's talk about 2 more freshmen. JT Thor, who I think really caught everybody a bit by surprise, because I think the expectation was, he's going back, to Auburn. Then all of a sudden, sort of around the combine, JT Thor mania hits. He doesn't actually play in the combine. And it's not like his athletic numbers were like through the roof or anything. Like he, blew it away with a, vertical jump or whatever. I'm not actually sure what sparked the JT Thor mania. I heard his interviews were just sort of okay, when I was talking to teams. But JT Thor is now being talked about not as a lottery pick, but starting sort of in the teens to early 20s now. How do you feel about that one?
Again, he's another guy that I'm much more comfortable in that 25 to 35 range, where I'm really throwing darts a little more. Has size, although a very skinny body, has shown some ability to score and shoot. So there are some tools there. But again, he was another guy, like I agree with you. He's a guy that I circled like, oh, this will be really interesting to watch this guy next year. See if he can be a top 20 guy his sophomore year, because he did seem more like a developmental guy, even though he showed flashes at Auburn this year. And so I don't know, to take that guy in the top 20, like, you're getting a 0 from him this year, certainly. Like, he's got to go to the G League. And it just seems so much more speculative to me than something you would take in the top 20.
Is there any rationale that, look, he's probably a lottery pick next year if he goes to Auburn, so I'm getting value by drafting a guy a year early, just sort of based off of how you're projecting him and probably what we thought coming back. I thought JT Thor, if I was putting together my 2022 big board, would probably, slot somewhere in the late lottery after, some of the freshmen and some of the international players sort of come off the board as far as kind of returning college basketball players. So is there any sort of mindset that says, like, we're just kind of jumping the gun? It's fine to wait a year. We'll let him develop in the G League, which, frankly, is a perfectly acceptable way for a college, for a player to develop. And we'll end up getting a lottery pick out of a pick that's in the 20s.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with that is that projection sort of priced in improvement that may or may not happen this coming year. So you go back and look at what your board was at the beginning of the year and where it is now. I mean, usually the top 4 or 5 guys it pretty much holds, and then it changes a lot after that, right?
It does. Yeah. Brandon Boston was in that. It was in that lottery. Ziaire Williams was in that lottery. Josh Christopher, was there, and so it definitely changes.
So I don't know if I would put too much stock in that. And then in the meantime, obviously you're taking up a roster spot and paying the guy $2 million or whatever. So it's not free, and you have to think about that too as you construct your team.
Let's talk about another player that's almost in exactly the same scenario. Again, I think a surprise decides to stay. Has like an okay combine. I think you mocked it a little bit. Josh Primo out of Alabama, who's one of the youngest players in this draft. And I think, again, the expectation was, given the role that he played at Alabama last year, he's going to come back and maybe this will kind of be his team as a sophomore. He's in the draft right now. Again, teams are looking at these sort of long 3-and-D, type wings, and he's very young and he's very thin and his body hasn't filled out or matured yet. And he shot it okay at Alabama. Any reason that Josh Primo should be in that consideration in the late teens or early 20s?
Yeah, I was surprised he got as much traction as he did, off of one combine game where he had, I think, like 7 points and 1 rebound or something.
Yeah, like 3 for 8 from the field. Yeah.
It's like, where are we setting the bar here?
Pretty low, but it is pretty low at the combine.
His age is definitely a factor in his favor. And we tend to underestimate that, I think, when we do the draft. So I think that does make him interesting, but he was the kind of the 5th guy at Alabama. And just didn't have a major offensive role. Shot okay, but I mean, you'd watch Alabama and you go long stretches and kind of forget he was on the floor. He didn't do wow stuff athletically or anything. Good size for a 2-3. I think he measured 6'6", right? I just don't know that there's that much there at the end of the day. So he's another guy that's, to me, just a very speculative selection. I think I ended up with him 42nd. So I guess I need a little more convincing.
I think one of the themes that I'm hearing from John on all these guys is he's not comfortable taking the speculative picks as late lottery to mid first round picks. Like, you're much more comfortable starting to speculate, especially on these young guys, as you get into the late first round to early second round. That seems to be where your comfort level sits with those types of players.
Well, especially when you're not talking about crazy upside. I mean, I had Poku in my top 15 last year because I just thought the ceiling outcomes were high enough to justify throwing the dart. But I don't see that with these guys, I guess. I think it's, the range of outcomes, I think, is more capped on the high side.
So let's go to what was the biggest red flag for me of the draft. How in the world is a Virginia player miss John Hollinger's draft board, but then starts showing up again in the mid-teens, and people talking about Trey Murphy being drafted, in the teens, and I'm like, this can't be right. Yeah. I know John watches like literally every minute of a Virginia game. I don't think he came up once in a conversation on a podcast that we talked about all year until like he starts to again sort of get that buzz around the draft combine. And so I'm just going to let you take it from there, because my guess is there isn't any guest that I could have on that has watched more Trey Murphy than you've watched Trey Murphy. The fact that you didn't have him in your top 30 is a massive red flag to me.
Okay.
That's like me not having a Kansas player in the top 30, and then everybody's saying, hey, Chad, this Kansas guy is going to be a potential lottery pick.
Yeah, although I guess I was too high on Devin Dotson last year, so you had him pegged correctly. So Trey Murphy, the big thing that stands out to me is like Virginia was so desperate for shot creation last year that literally anyone who could do anything off the dribble was going to get an opportunity to do that. And like Trey Murphy couldn't do it. So you're talking about a low usage shooter, and he can shoot and he has size, but I guess I question how much overall offensive impact he's going to be able to deliver when he's just giving you nothing off the dribble. Surely he's not posting up or anything. Pretty good at
106 pounds, I think. Is what he weighed exactly at Chicago.
Pretty good athlete, so he might be able to get a little more in transition. Virginia never runs, so you wouldn't really know that from watching us play. And now the thing I think teams like about him, his defensive tape was good. He can slide his feet. He can stay in front of people. I think he has to play three because he's so thin. He doesn't give you anything on the glass. But I think he can slide his feet and stay in front of threes. And so I think for that reason, you're looking at like a 3-and-D package with him. And I just think that's all you're getting. Like that's it might be his floor and his ceiling at the same time. And so like, do you need to draft that? Like, I don't know. Can you sign that for $3 million and draft something else? So I think that's where my questions come in. Like, I do think he's probably going to have a career, just based off the shooting and the ability to slide his feet. I just don't think there's a whole lot else there.
It's damning words from John Hollinger, just based off probably wanting to see more Virginia players succeed in the league. Though, 3-and-D is the in vogue thing. And one thing that you can say about, a number of these prospects that we've been talking about is that's how they're projecting. Whether there actually is a 3 to their game, or in some cases, whether there's actually an D to their game.
D to their game. Yeah, exactly.
Fair enough. But, teams are looking for wings. John's made this point, throughout the draft, that this is the most valuable position right now to draft. And so maybe that's why Trey Murphy, I absolutely think that's why Trey Murphy is rising right now, is that's what they're seeing. And there's only so many of those types of prospects in this draft, and at least a little bit more proven track record with Trey Murphy there. All right. One last guy that we'll talk about in the rising, Vrenz Bleijenbergh out of Belgium. There's always an international man of mystery, 7-footer, pretty good ball handler. Like, he claims he's a guard, shot it okay. Intriguing skill set for a 7-footer, skinny, gets pushed around in the Belgium league, which isn't necessarily, what you want to hear. This isn't a particularly high level European league compared to, we're not talking about the Spanish ACB or the Turkish league here. But again, people trying to find 7-footers that are skilled and are decent athletes and can do some stuff. Any justification that he sneaks into the first round?
Boy, I think that's a serious reach. I mean, the Belgian league isn't good, and he wasn't notably good in that league, right? Like, it's not like, oh, it's a bad league, but he dominated, so maybe we can justify this a little more. It's like he's a not particularly good player in a not particularly good league. You remember Euro Slokar?
I do actually remember him. That's like sad that I do, but
to me, it's like one of those deals. Like, European guy shows up and does some stuff in workouts, and all of a sudden everyone's talking about him. And it's like, did you see this guy play at his games? Like, I don't know if there's anything.
Nicholas Skidishvili is the first guy that really burned me, on that end. And as a young reporter, I wish I would have pushed Mike D'Antoni, who was his coach back in Italy, more about if this guy is so great, why don't you play him? Ever. Right. In games. If you're saying he should be a top 5 pick in the NBA draft. And some of that's Europe, but probably not Belgium league. Little bit different when you're playing for, in Treviso and on Benetton.
Yeah, I think he's much more of a stash pick to me. I just can't see justifying taking him in the first round. Actually, I'm bummed out. The guy I did like from overseas, Rocco Perkisson, pulled his name out, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, there John just pours cold water over all the hot draft prospects that are rising up boards. I kind of expected that's what's going to be, but I love having this voice on the podcast, right? Because there just starts to be this growing narrative about some of these guys, and I can fall into it too. Like for Ziaire Williams for me, where I can start to talk myself into guys. I like the consistency and the push that no, let's not get irrational about some of these prospects we get close to the draft, and you can sort of understand why it happens. So we'll talk next about, guys, the other sort of irrationality, which is the sort of love affair that has come in this draft towards those 22-year-old and older prospects getting some love in the lottery. But first, let's talk about Built Bar. Did you know that Built Bar has 9 delicious flavors plus the occasional limited time flavor? When you talk to Built Bar fan, they're definitely passionate about their faves. If you don't know the Built Bar flavors, well, you're missing out. There's coconut almond, cherry, raspberry, mint brownie, peanut butter brownie, double chocolate, salted caramel. So there's something for everyone. My personal favorite is coconut. I'm a Mounds Bar guy. It tastes like a Mounds Bar. These things are chewy. They're moist. They're not the sort of dry, chalky protein bar that you typically think about. If you're an Almond Joy fan, then there's coconut almond there for you. And if you're not sure what you like, there are mixed boxes where you can get 2 of each flavor. The big thing about Built Bar, though, is that they're healthy. They have 17 grams of protein, only 130 calories, only 4 grams of sugar, only 4 grams of net carbs. So order today and get that raspberry or mint brownie or whatever you like. Go to BuiltBar.com, use promo code LOCK15. You'll get 15% off your first order. Use promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at BuiltBar.com. And I'm back now with John Hollinger of The Athletic. John, appreciate your constant voice on these podcasts. Always a unique take on things. And I know you take flack from that because I don't think you care very much about the consensus, but I think that your experience, both working in front offices and your approach to the draft, you have a system and an approach to it, I think really matters. I think for many people out there, they're spitballing this. Who do you like this day? And I really like this sort of disciplined approach. So I'm going to go back to, I think maybe something that you personally may have introduced to the draft world, or at least to the fans of the draft world way back in ESPN, is that age matters in the draft.
Yes.
It matters on the young end. It matters on the old end. And I segue every year to Dick Vitale on the ESPN podcast, losing it because the college basketball player of the year, the decorated senior, is sliding on draft boards every year. And, PTPer, this person's proven, they've won at every level. How can NBA teams be passing on them? And this is based off an analytics take that essentially says that at a certain age becomes a detriment against you. And, I just recently went back and looked at 22-year-old players and older that have been drafted in the last decade. And as you can probably imagine, because you've certainly sort of made this point before, it's not great.
Yeah.
It really isn't. So here's the list.
Okay.
In the last decade, 22 and over lottery picks.
Okay.
Jimmer Fredette, Kelly Olynyk, Doug McDermott, Willie Cauley-Stein, Taurean Prince, Denzel Valentine, Frank Kaminsky, Chris Dunn, Buddy Hield, and Obi Toppin. And now we're talking about 3 prospects that are getting lottery love here. Davion Mitchell out of Baylor, Corey Kispert out of Gonzaga, and Chris Duarte out of Oregon. And interestingly, Duarte's older than all of those guys.
Yeah.
On draft night, he's already 24 years old. And Davion Mitchell is older than everyone other than Chris Dunn, before they were drafted. Maybe Cam Thomas actually as well. I think Cam Thomas ended up being 23 on draft night as well. And of that group, who do you want to, fight? Mike DeCourcy of Sporting News got all over me on Twitter about this for, again, sort of shaming seniors, and like Cam Johnson. Who's been pretty good.
Yeah.
In a kind of a bad draft.
Yeah. But I still think you want a little more upside than that when you're picking in the lottery. That pick has worked out. So props to the Suns. I would say, Kispert is probably the guy I would fight for the most, just because I think he had arguably the better college season of the 3. I think what he does translates the most. I think he's not just a good shooter. I think he's really underrated, attacking closeouts, putting the ball on the floor, getting out in transition and scoring that way. To me, he reminds me so much of Joe Harris, just in terms of the fact that he's not just shooting, but he's also able to get basket attacks out of it and finish at a high level, because he's a big, strong guy. So when he gets to the cup, he can get there and do something. And so I think there's some good potential there for him to be kind of a plus version of Doug McDermott. The irony is, he could very easily end up replacing Doug McDermott, right, if he goes to the Pacers, and just plug right into that role. So I like Kispert once you get out of the top 10.
I think you had him at 12, right, on your board.
I have him 12th. Yeah, exactly.
Which is a surprise, because typically we don't see 22-year-olds, making the John Hollinger lottery for this reason. And frankly, not just that I just gave you the entire list. I wasn't cherry picking. I gave you the entire list over the last decade. And so this is something that generally NBA teams agree. It's actually a fairly small sample size when you think there's 14 picks in the lottery. And I just went over a decade. So, there's 140 picks, and I think I just listed out 8 names. Right. So it is a bit of a small sample size. Kispert shockingly sort of makes that for you. Davion Mitchell probably is the guy that gets talked about the most, of maybe going as high as 7 to the Warriors, though it does seem to me pretty fair that if the Warriors do pass on him at 7, then maybe New Orleans is the next shot at 10, and then it probably gets to Indiana at 13. So he quickly starts moving to the bottom of the lottery pretty quick if just 1 or 2 teams sort of pass on him. And so where his draft range actually is, I'm not actually sure 7 is really fair. There's one very unique situation with Golden State. So you had him, I think, 16th. On the board. And so just sort of right outside the lottery. And is age the primary thing here that sinks him out of the lottery in your
I think
mind?
age sinks him, and I'm still worried about his offense. You know, he shot the ball well this year. He had not at any other point in his career. He's still not a good foul shooter, and he's pretty small. So I kind of worry about what he's going to be able to do offensively. I don't worry about him on defense. I mean, his ball pressure is insane. Competes really hard, gets a ton of steals. So I don't worry about him on that end. But offensively, I just wonder where his contribution is going to be.
And then the big surprise, Chris Duarte, who's not just like old, but old, like historic old for a player getting drafted, not just like potentially in the lottery, but in the first round at 24 years old. I was shocked when he showed up in an early draft column for you. And then again at 19, I believe, on your board, just given that now we're talking about someone who's like 2 years older than Corey Kispert. In this draft, and 5 years older than some other prospects, just 1 year younger than Cam Johnson right now. You've got to be pretty good, my guess is, to be able to crack John Hollinger 20 and be 24 years old.
Yeah, I mean, his statistical output, it was the same thing last year, where his statistical output was so good that you looked at him and you said, okay, if it weren't for his age, you definitely have to put him in the lottery and maybe even pretty high in the lottery. Like, he was definitely, if he wasn't the best wing in college basketball last year, he was definitely on the short list. And he can just do so many things that translate immediately to the NBA. So you give up upside with him, but I do think he is as plug and play as it gets in this draft. Like, I'd be surprised if he isn't able to play immediately. And frankly, he'd be a disappointment if he isn't able to play immediately at his age, because he can shoot, he can do stuff with the ball. He's a pretty good defender, reads the game pretty well. Like, he just checks every box for an NBA wing.
Except he's not a great athlete and he doesn't have length, right? I mean, those are two things that typically we want out of wings as well. And he's got a sort of just a sort of, well, what I think a 6'7" wingspan at 6'6", and he's not by any stretch of the imagination a plus athlete. Does that concern you at all? Because those are two things typically that factor in as well when we're thinking about especially NBA wings.
Yeah, I mean, it would worry me a little bit, but he's able to, like, the fact that he's able to be such an effective player, I think, kind of outweighs that. I'll go back to another Oregon prospect, Chad, who did not measure very long. You might have heard me mention this guy, Dillon Brooks, once or twice. So,
this is your Dillon Brooks, isn't it? Just admit it. This is your Dillon Brooks guy. If you were in the Grizzlies front office right now, you'd be beating your chest right now. We're going to do Dillon Brooks 2.0.
Yeah, exactly. So I think Duarte has a good chance to make it. I think it just depends on the team too. For a team like the Lakers, I think who were drafting 22, I think, or whatever.
Knicks, I think looking at 19.
Yeah, a win now team
14.
Yeah, a win now team he makes a lot more sense for. So it's going to be a little bit dependent on the team picking.
Let me ask you just one last question about that then, because that is the thinking with all three of these. It's going to be a team like the Warriors, maybe a team like the Pacers, who have Rick Carlisle, who historically is a little bit, doesn't like playing rookies, wants to win now.
Yeah.
And then you start getting into, the Grizzlies, the Wizards, the Knicks, the Hawks, teams that absolutely have deep playoff aspirations right now. But it also seems to be true, and I think you've made this point before, that rookies just generally are bad, period.
Yeah.
That the transition to the NBA, whether you're 18 or 20, 22 or 23, is such that, typically they don't even sort of work out to be replacement level players, at least their first year in the NBA. That there's a transition that just means that counting on rookies to help you is probably not the wisest one, especially teams in the playoffs. That, as you start to get deeper and into the playoffs, that you want guys that can really help you right now. So is this a waste of a pick for a team like Golden State, who might draft the guy because he can theoretically help me more than an 18-year-old, but then the truth is that they're a below level replacement player anyway, because they're making that transition to the NBA. And so they don't really help me anyway. And so it's a double loss. I miss out on the upside of a young player to draft the guy who can help me now. But then history sort of tells us that rookies don't really help you win basketball games in their first year. Or is that a misunderstanding of what typically happens?
Well, I mean, the other thing that history tells you is the rookies that do help do tend to be the upperclassmen. If you look at last year, for instance, like Xavier Tillman or, Desmond Bain, Emmanuel Quickly, who was a sophomore at least. I mean, those were the guys who were kind of making plus contributions toward winning almost right out of the chute. So I do think there's a case to be made here that Duarte certainly could be that kind of guy.
Would you be comfortable if the Warriors take him at 14 or the Pacers take him at 13?
I think that feels reachy to me. To me, like, he makes a ton of sense for the Laker pick at 24. I think I said 22.
22.
Before. I think it is 22. Okay.
Yeah.
So like the Lakers pick is more to me where he starts making a ton of sense. Golden State, if Golden State, if you're going to take him at 14, trade down and take him at 18 or whatever at least, Well,
but I don't know. The buzz is there for Duarte. I really think he's legitimately in probably the 13 to 19 range right now, based off of what I can get, and that's just the buzz. But again, he had a really awesome junior and senior season at Oregon, and I think teams are exactly seeing what John sees, a guy that can come in and be a 3-and-D wing like day one, and that's attractive for some teams. Well, my last question to you was going to be, who is the Dillon Brooks of this draft? But I think we answered it already.
Well, no. The guy I really got to carry the flag for is Miles McBride from West Virginia. Okay. I think he's been undervalued this whole process. I really like him. I think he's going to be able to play somewhat right away and then potentially be a starter, whether at 1 or 2. And I have him in my top 20. I still wonder if I rated him too low. Competitor, long arms, can shoot it. I just think there's a lot to like there.
All right. So when Miles McBride wins MVP of the G League next year, John Hollinger is going to take his Paul Reed victory lap.
Exactly.
I guess I should ask you, who's your Paul Reed in this draft? And maybe it's asking the same question.
My Paul Reed is probably more Neemias Queta from Utah State, who I have in the 20s, and I don't think anyone else has in their top 45. So that's the one where I'm really on an island with a big guy. But I think there's a lot to like with him. I'm really interested to see where he ends up.
I will point out at this point in the podcast that I did not pay John Hollinger to say Neemias Queta, because now I'm going to be able to hashtag Neemias Queta in this, and this video is going to blow up in Portugal, where his fan base is absolutely insane. Just love how the Portuguese come out for Neemias Queta. It's really, truly something to behold. Every time I mention him in a column or Twitter, sort of the excitement that comes. So there's Neemias Queta, the Paul Reed of the 2021 NBA draftees. John Hollinger, for the first time, we're seeing each other's faces. We hope that our bald heads and the glow off of them didn't blind you in this podcast. We've tried to be merciful in the past and just do audio, but it's great to see your face, John. I really appreciate everything that you've done to contribute to our knowledge in the 2021 draft, especially on this podcast. And I'm sure we'll be talking about 2022 draft pretty soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on the show, Chad.
All right. Well, you've been listening to Chad Ford's NBA Big Board on the Locked On Podcast Network. You've been watching it on YouTube. Keep coming back and a podcast every day this week. And then the live broadcast of the 2021 NBA draft happening on the Locked On NBA YouTube channel. You've been listening to Chad Ford's NBA Big Board. Aloha.